Shalom, I'm Dr. Dinah Dye with Foundations in Torah and HRN, and we are in a study on the service of the heart. We have spent quite a few weeks building a foundation and understanding the service of the heart, what that meant, the prayers, how they were put together, who's responsible for them, the purpose of the prayers. And we understand that it began in Babylon when they were in exile, and over time it has really been the glue that has held the Jewish people together when they have been scattered to the four corners of the earth. The key figure in all this has been Ezra. Ezra, under the men of the Great Assembly, they are responsible for really codifying the prayers and setting the order of things. Initially, it was set very loosely. It wasn't meant to be really structured. Of course, over time, now we're at 2,500 years or so, that the structure has become more cemented. But initially, it was fairly loose. Now, we talked last time about how Ezra was the one who held up the Torah, unfolded the scroll, they would read from it, and the blessings would be said, and then the people would say Amen. These are just some of the things that Ezra was responsible for, introducing the concept of the benediction and the blessing and sort of concluding prayers, all these various elements. Also, Ezra was responsible for this idea of the Torah being read with a distinctive chant. This was his doing. He also set forth the pattern of reading the Torah in public services. That wasn't something that was done before. Of course, again, these are substitutes for what took place in the temple. And he introduced the custom of reading the Torah on Mondays and Thursdays. And today we find in the Siddur, when we get to the Taknoon prayers, that those are initiated at times on Mondays and Thursdays. Seems kind of bizarre to have these 2 days that they were chosen to read. But there was a reason for that, and that's because those were the market days. And so the folks came in to buy and sell, and so it made it easy to have those be the times of reading the Torah. The farmers would come to town to sell their produce, and others would come to purchase. So that particular custom has prevailed with us, and has seen its way into the Siddur. In addition, we had talked about the prophets and the writings in the Torah, and how in Babylon the prophets were the ones responsible to kind of keep alive the concept of the Torah and alive the concept of the temple. But we also have some other authors in terms of the Siddur. Certainly with the Pharisees added on to it. They were the authors of the Jerusalem and the Jerusalem Talmud, and of course in Babylon, the Babylonian Talmud. There were all kinds of brilliant scholars and sages that added various aspects to it, and we see that these two Talmuds begin to be developed, although it isn't really until about 200 BCE into about 400 of the Common Era that these actually get written down. But the oral tradition is being passed down, and we see this certainly in the Siddur and the prayer service. And you can find now, you'll read various parts in there that'll come from the Talmud. Now, the Exiles return. Of course, we're at the time of 332 is the time of Alexander the Great. And it's hard to conceive of the Siddur and the prayer service developing and thinking about Alexander the Great at the same time. But this is a period in which there were some very significant developments in the area of the liturgy. Most of it had kind of been outlines and some sort of general formulations, and now it's moving into something more fixed. There really hadn't been any official written prayers for public worship. The specific wording was not really composed for some time now, and again, the Pharisees were some that composed some of the structure of this. They were certainly the ones that were the teachers in the synagogue, and again, the ones that authored the Talmud. One of the reasons that the Siddur, the service of the heart, the prayer service spread, it was said to be a weapon against Hellenism. So they saw the dangers in Hellenism as it was creeping into certainly the culture at large and then creeping into Judaism, and they resolved to fight that. And they felt that the chief weapon to fight it was certainly the spread of the Torah, but also the service of the heart was another way to fight Hellenism from infecting their communities. The arena for all of this eventually became the synagogue. This is where there was an opportunity for those to bring an interpretation of the Torah readings. In fact, in those early days, it would be in sort of an Aramaic vernacular. And this idea of the homily. So we have it became part of the feature of Jewish worship. So we have the rabbi come in and he would give kind of an interpretation on a portion of the scripture and kind of turn it into sort of practical application, spiritual application for the folks of the day. And so the concept of the homily begins to develop. We want to look a little bit in we have a picture here of the temple, 2 temples, that the prayers again became the substitute. The liturgy in the temple service, by the time we get to the Second Temple period, has its own development. Obviously we don't know everything that was part of the liturgy in the First Temple period. But by the time we get to the Second Temple period, now we're beginning to know a lot of this. And so there is something developing within the temple structure, now that we have a temple rebuilt, that is different in a way from what is developing in the synagogue. So 2 things are happening at the same time. Now, eventually, once the temple's destroyed, some of that will end up in the synagogue, but there is also said that some of the things that were developing in the synagogue ended up in the temple, and nobody's really sure who started where and which went where, etc. There was just sort of this thing kind of came together and mixed, if you will. But there was a liturgy then for the temple, and there was a liturgy then for the synagogue, and this was important. In the in the temple, in the Second Temple period, there was a special chamber called the Lishkat Hagazit, which was the chamber of hewn stone, and that's the place where it was basically the seat of the Great Sanhedrin. That's where they would meet, and they would rule. They were the supreme court, if you will, of Israel, and they would rule on civil, criminal, judicial issues, and that was kind of that was their seat of justice. And it was that at dawn, when the whole day would start in the temple, and the Kohanim had actually performed their very first services of the temple, that would be the morning sacrifice or the morning offering, which we call the shacharit. They would then go down to the chamber, the Lishkat Hagazit, the chamber of hewn stone, and they would conduct a service down there. And this area was very central to the Holy Temple. In fact, I find it kind of interesting, maybe more than that today there is an Israeli firm that's already drawn up architectural plans for the chamber of hewn stone for the Lishkat Hagazit. And so there's a sense of the return of the Great Sanhedrin, the supreme judicial body of Israel. And we've seen about, 5 years ago or so, that there was a reformation of the Sanhedrin after about 1,500 years of there not being one. So there's some significant things happening, movement towards the rebuilding of the temple, and certainly designing a new chamber for the Great Sanhedrin to meet is very significant, because after all, that was part of the daily services, as they assembled there for the daily service. Now, where it was located in temple time was a convenient area. Now, the Kohanim would be, after that, they'd meet at the chamber of hewn stone. They would return to the altar of burnt offering, and there they completed the animal offering. Now, there are many different offerings. I'm talking in here about the burnt offering, the Tamid Korban Olah, the elevation offering. And so that was done first thing in the morning. That was the most important of the offerings. And then, of course, there was another one that was done exactly the same. We say in kind of late afternoon, 3 o'clock would have been the time, and they would slaughter the animal in the afternoon. But some of these blessings and benedictions that we find in the Siddur are connected to the actual offering. There's one called True and Firm. Today it's recited after the Shema, but it's related again to this morning service and the offering service. Again, the Kohanim would return there, they'd complete that offering, and then the final act of the morning, this was part of the final act of the morning worship, and they would bestow the priestly blessing on the congregation. All those who were assembled in the courtyard, the last thing they would do was, "May the Lord bless you and keep you, may his face to shine upon you." So that was part of it as well. Let's just look at that blessing in whole in Numbers 6:22 through 24. Very significant is the blessing is actually composed of 15 words, and that number is very significant as well in terms of worship. And so, "May Adonai bless you and keep you. May Adonai make his face shine upon you and show you his favor. May Adonai lift up his face toward you and give you peace." And this was how the priests were to bless the children of Israel, bless the people. And of course, the first of the priesthood from Aaron, the brother of Moshe, and down through his sons and down through the Levites. And it says, "In this way they are to put my name on the people of Israel so that I will bless them." Again, I mentioned the number 15, and I'll probably be picking up this theme as I weave in and out of this, but the number 15 is said to be a number that is very important in worship. It meant the highest level of worshiping God, partly because the name of God, Yah, has a value of 15. And in the liturgy, many of the prayers are structured around the number 15. And as I'm going through, I'll make sure that I try to mention that to show you. The one you might be most familiar with, of course, is the Aaronic benediction, composed of 15 words. But we have the 15 songs of ascent, 120 through 134, as the pilgrims made their way up to Jerusalem for the various festivals. And with each step, they would sing one of these songs of ascent. And when the Levitical choir would stand on the steps before the Nicanor gate, there were 15 steps. So those are just two examples for now. But we find that example all over Scripture. Now, the priests were to be conduits for the blessing of God. They would bless the people and then essentially be the conduit between the people and God. And this particular blessing, the Aaronic benediction, was one that was inserted into the Shmoneh Esrei, which is the Amidah, which is the standing prayers, which is the 18 benedictions. It all is exactly the same thing. It just has a variety of names, but it is what we call the prayer, the tefillah, the main prayer. And it is actually the Lord's Prayer of Yeshua, we call it that, is really a summary of, in a way, of the Amidah. So it was the center and the heartbeat of the structure of the prayer service that Ezra and the men of the Great Assembly designed. They would pray, of course, part of the prayer of the Amidah was praying for the return of the temple service. So this is something that's said every day. There are several different prayers actually, but within the Amidah is a prayer to the Father to return the temple and return the temple service. And so this is something prayed every day, a reminder. And so we see that in the Amidah. Certainly the Levites would recite special psalms for the day that coincided with there was a song of the day, Monday through Saturday. And each prayer song of the day connected to some value that the Lord was trying to impart into the people, and the Levites would sing this particular psalm. And we'll probably touch on what they actually were, but for now, just know that every day there was a different one. We see the Shabbat now sort of developing in the temple. The liturgy, it was in the temple. It was sort of separated, set apart from what was done in the home. So we actually have three things happening. There's a service for Shabbats developing in the home, there's one developing in the synagogue, and then there's the Shabbat service in the temple. So at the time of Yeshua, all three of these are working in conjunction with one another. And so there's various blessings that are connected with these different services. Now, one of the most elaborate services of the year would be Yom Kippur, Yom HaKippurim. It was one of the most special, certainly, and I know some of you are familiar. You can read about that in Leviticus 16, about what the high priest did and what went on in the services. It is in the Siddur, you'll find a very detailed description of that temple ritual for that day. And that included a variety of different liturgies. called the Seder Avodah, the order of the service. It was considered, well, the most spectacular of the services would have been Sukkot, and there were certainly, you're familiar with the service of the water drawing, and the service with the great lights that were in the court of the women. There was all kinds of things that were associated with Sukkot. So all these things are developing. Certainly at Sukkot, I know a lot of you are familiar with the waving of the lulav and the etrog, and all this was all happening in the context of the temple. And then, of course, eventually, as they were exiled again, we see it happening in the context of the synagogue, and then also in the home. And we see that in our communities today. A lot of these things are expressed more in the home. Some of us aren't connected to a synagogue per se. We may have a congregation where we would meet for Sukkot, for instance, and we would shake the lulav and the etrog, et cetera, and say the specific blessings. But all those blessings that we say really go back to the time of this Second Temple period, the time when Yeshua was there, and there's information about it in the Mishnah and in a variety of sources to let us know how they worshipped in that way. Again, I mentioned the 15 Psalms of Ascent. They are from Psalms 120 to 134. And now many do believe, like for instance, this particular order of Psalms, these 15 Psalms, they believe that some of these liturgical elements for the temple actually originated in the synagogue, but it's not clear, and it's pretty hard to tell where they really did originate, and we can't know for sure. The daily morning service, certainly conducted by the Kohanim, the priest in the temple, had, with the fruit of our lips, had its origins in the synagogue, but really the two were intertwined and things developed out of each. So let's read here Psalm 66:13. It says that I will come into your house with burnt offerings. I will fulfill my vows to you. Those my lips pronounced and my mouth spoke when I was in distress. Again, I want to show you the connection then between the burnt offering, which was the offering in the morning, and the offering in the evening from Numbers 28, 1 through 8, and the fruit of our lips, or the expression of our lips, the expression that comes out of our mouth. There was a connection between the two. This from Psalm 66, going from 16 to 20. Come and listen, all you who fear God, and I will tell you what he has done for me. I cried out to him with my mouth. His praise was on my tongue. Again, you see this association between what comes out of our mouth and the services themselves. It says, had I cherished evil thoughts, Adonai would not have listened, but in fact, he did listen. He paid attention to my prayer. So the prayer, the fruit of our lips, the words that come from our mouth, all associated with the burnt offering, because that the time in which we express the words from our mouth, the meditations of our heart, come at the time of the burnt offering, which eventually we have the shacharit, which is the morning service, and the mincha, which is the afternoon service. By the time we get to Acts chapter 2, we see that the shacharit is at 9 a.m. in the morning, and the mincha is at 3 p.m. So this is all getting to be pretty well established by the time of the first century. And it says in the Talmud, by that time there were actually 394 synagogues in Jerusalem alone, but all basically under the banner of the structure of the temple. But you see how many different synagogues there were. And so that was true when you went out into the empire, into the various places in Galatia and certainly in Rome and Corinth. And there were numerous synagogues. Alexandria was sort of a great center for a lot of Jewish people, and many, many synagogues. But they all, the difference then when you compare it to today with all our different denominations, the varying denominations have different codes and creeds and dogmas and doctrines, etc. But really, if you went to a specific community, for instance, in the city of Alexandria, you would have sort of a leadership over the community, and then all the synagogues were basically functioning under that authority. But everybody was more or less on the same page, which is fairly impossible in a Jewish community. but they were functioning under the authority of a group of elders in that community. And so we see here in the diaspora, every community had a synagogue. And really, when the new community started, that was probably the first thing that was constructed. So obviously, larger communities would have a number of different places to worship, but it appeared things existed fairly harmoniously, that it doesn't appear from what we have that there was a whole lot of competition between them, but I'm sure there was some. It was understood that the temple stood as the center of the sanctity of God and the sanctity of the nation. So the temple in Jerusalem, when it stood in the first century, Second Temple period, that was the strength, that was the center, and everything kind of went back to that. But people function and live in different parts of the empire, and many of them probably couldn't even make it up to Jerusalem for the various feasts. So they could operate in their own synagogues, something like what we do today. The synagogue also became the very center of family life. So this is really critical, especially when the temple is destroyed. So family life and the synagogue are inextricably connected to one another. This is a place where they would go and hear God's Torah, and they would have it explained by teachers and rabbis who were dedicated to that end. And this is all, again, developing together, and once the diaspora takes place, the synagogue now assumes central position, and that's what we have from the time of the destruction of the temple right up to modern day present times, and we wait anxiously for the rebuilding of the temple, And so what we have developing within the synagogue over the next 1,500 years or so to modern day is that the synagogue becomes the place and the house of study and the house of prayer. It's kind of the substitute. And it is the institution for the Jewish people in the diaspora. And the Kohanim are certainly, there are ones that serve in the temple in that responsibility, and they, of course, in the temple precincts, they had the structure and what they were responsible for. So now that had to find its way in the synagogue, and so it was sort of a substitution of what was done in the temple. The daily prayer became sort of the normal part of everyday prayer, and so there were those that always went to the synagogue every day at the hour of prayer, the shacharit and the mincha, to pray and to go into the order of the service. And of course, again, this is from the fruit of the lips, no longer giving an offering. And so many in the community, that's where they would meet every single day, and certainly then on the Shabbat they would meet together. And so the offering of their lips became the daily offering or sacrifice on behalf of the nation without the temple standing. And it was quite the system that they developed was really quite amazing. And again, God is the author of all this, and He provided a way to prevent the people from losing their identity and to keep the community intact, even though it was scattered to the four corners of the world. Now, back at the temple, we have this thing called the 24 courses, or the ma'amadot. They were the 24 courses of the priest, and they were actually the courses coincided to the elders of Israel, if you will. And they were representatives of 24 different districts that were designed in Israel, which is said to have come from King David himself. And they rotated every week. Their service to the temple, they would go up and serve for a week, except at festival time. All of them would go up at the same time. So the way it was designed, they would actually go up for a week twice each year, once in the first half of the year and once in the second half of the year. Those that were in the home would gather in the synagogue at the same time, and then certain psalms and prayers that were being chanted in the temple service were also being chanted in the home or in the synagogue. That way, we just sort of keep this link then between the temple and the synagogue, between the times of daily prayer, the morning and the evening, and the synagogue services are then tied to those morning and evening prayers and the offering system. And the influence of the temple on the liturgy is great at this time, and the influence is now great in the synagogue, and I think much greater than most people have even recognized. And I think if we rearrange our thinking on this, and we see the value of these prayers and how connected they are to the temple, and how many of us are excited and looking with hope and anticipation for the rebuilding of the temple, then perhaps it will change our minds about the whole design and structure of the service of the heart, of the prayers. So this is kind of key, and I'm trying to, in this whole series, show you how they are connected. The synagogue and the services didn't appear out of nowhere, but they are very much connected to the prayer service. So I think we'll pick it up next time, because I want to talk a little bit more about what happens following the destruction of the temple in 70 Common Era, and how that really shakes up the faith, but yet the structure is in place to prevent the people from just going into assimilation or from completely falling apart and losing their identity and their foundation. So we'll talk about that next time, and we'll see you then. Shalom. Thank you.